is there a truly reality out there that humans can really know? It's an age-old battle between realists and absolutists. God is not great, how religion ruins everything. And yet it's utterly and totally ridiculous. We need to live for something beyond ourselves. Albert Goldbarth was one of my favorite poets, and he wrote this poem called How the World Works, an essay. And basically he's looking at, well, the interconnectedness of all things and how supposedly everything is interconnected with each other. He starts out by talking about, quote, in Nepal, a preacher reams a spoonful of musk from that orifice near the urethra, holding with his other gloved hand the deer's small death kick steady. Then the scene switches to 3 a.m. at some joint in Midtown Manhattan, a place called Chico's, when, quote, Prince Pimp enters swimming in coke, with one new frou-frou, acolyte on each eel-skim arm, and he reeks from the vial of musk. From the Nepal poacher to the Midtown pimp, all the interconnectedness of everything. Then, in this poem, he talks about a time when he was a kid. He was about 8 or so. He and his father were driving, and a cop pulled him over. And this is what he writes. Officer, have you had any breakfast? Why, no, sir. And he wetted his finger and thumb. He always did this with his money. And from, as my father called it, his billfold, a 5, you could do it for 5 in those days, sleeked on over. Later, educative and high on this mastery, he winked and told me that was how the world worked. That was how the world worked. That was the theme of his poem. He then talked about how his father explained how the world worked, how everything was, quote, part of an interlocking system for him, a neat, clean, perfect processional circle of textbook arrows. Here again, in another place, he's talking about how the world works. His father's talking to him. He says, so you invite the boss to dinner and use the holiday in silver and cordelate jokes that were a riot, and thus you advanced. You schmoozed the waitress and her service upgraded. This was a very clear flow chart, and I sing the songs of its unctuous functioning well. I was 8. I believed him. He believed himself. In other words, again, this is the way the world works. Then when he talked about his father's death, this is what he wrote. Well, now he's in the globe, beyond maneuvering. I saw him lowered. Now he's part of the parfait striations I'm singing of, part of the nitrogen flywheel hovel and palace totality works called Terra, where the butterfly fish at mating time, the vivid-hued and specifically patterned butterfly fish fight rivals with its colors for weapons, its cinnabars and its viridins, deepening and quivering them, while back out at Chico's, the pimp prince stands, his gaudy ground in front of the would-be usurper, plumed hats, ostrich boots, gold necklaces, one ruby ring, one jade. Oh, the world not only works, but works rarefiedly in top-notch G. Willikers forms. In other words, and then through the poem, Goldbarth then went on, just talking with incredible beauty, imagination, and language, showing the amazing and unexpected interconnectedness of things in life, things that we don't usually expect at all. He's saying everything just fits together so nicely. And this is what he learned from his father, how well everything works. Then he comes to the end of the poem, which goes like this. And here's how the poem ends. He says, once, after my father had died, but before the family car was sold, I joy rode with a lady, one-handed wheeling up the curves past Lighthouse Point. A cop clocked our speed. An hour later, I was in custody, a shabby, roach-infested custody, for attempting to bribe. It was bad, but I was good, and it was brief. What's longer and sticks with me more is being dropped off back at the car, too tired to even feel defeated, somewhere on the damp miles from anywhere to 3 or 4 in the morning. When the engine wouldn't turn, that last indignity, all I could do was sit stupidly humming, not singing, just humming on the hood, and stare at the first gray rhythmic swashings in and out of the water, sure that nothing ever does or ever had really or would ever work. You know, I think there are a lot of ways to interpret this poem, but I think this is a coming-of-age poem. It's about starting to understand that maybe the things your dad had taught you, or that you were raised on, or the worldview that you had learned as a child, that you had developed when you suddenly come to realize that it didn't work, that it wasn't true, that maybe you were raised on, and maybe you inherited, and maybe you have believed lies. Maybe these lies were wired into you. All his life, his father told him everything worked, everything was interconnected. Then boom, at the end, he tries to bribe the cop, he gets thrown in jail, everything falls apart. That's what he learned. So again, I think this is a poem about coming to the realization that maybe everything isn't the way you thought it would be. Maybe everything that you believed in or thought that you believed in turned out not to be what you thought, turned out not to be what you believed in. Ever been through that? I mean, ever been filled with doubt about all that you were once certain of? Ever wonder if the axioms and postulates and foundations and theorems of life, things that you took for granted, things that you just knew had to be true, had to be right, were foundational, ever suddenly discover that maybe they weren't what you thought they were at all? And maybe you suddenly got the stark realization that they were wrong, that the foundation of everything you believed were wrong. You know, Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote about falling through a kind of infinite abyss, falling forward, backward, left, right, falling in all these directions with nothing to hold on to, nothing to grab, just falling back and forth and so on. And I think this was his sense. This sense of basically saying, hey, all the values of the Western world, all that we had believed was falling and disappearing, and what do you have to hold on to? Now, I don't want to get so grand about that, you know, the whole values of the Western world. I want to be much more uptight, up close and personal. I want to be in your face. I wish I was close enough to you to where I'm talking, you could smell my breath, or I would be spitting on you. You'd feel my spit. But I want to ask you, you know, have you ever wondered if you've been fed a bill of goods? If all that you took for granted turned out to be fairy tales, myths, lies, myths, maybe even wrapped up in the certainty of science. Well, if it's science, then boom, that's certain. That's what they tell you. And maybe something that you thought was absolutely certain came with the certainty of numbers, of formulas, or scientific pronouncements. You ever thought maybe it's all wrong? Everything you've taught has been wrong? I've been there. I know what that's like. I've had the mooring kicked out. Ever feel like you were trying to build a ship while you were floating at sea in rough water? Not a fun place to be. Not an easy place to get the boat built and moving again. Not an easy way to avoid sinking and drowning. And that's what I believe Goldbarth's poem was about. It's not a nice place to be stuck there with that car, the engine dead, having just been thrown in jail for bribing when it worked so well 30 years earlier for his father. It's not a nice place to be, but it is a place where you can start to ask new questions. You can start to ask questions as Albert did, new questions about how the world works.